Thank you very much, Vincent, ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure to be here. The first time I spoke here in 1990 was the most intimidating audience I'd ever had to speak to. It wasn't because I found the people of Donegal scary, but my 3 daughters were in the audience and they wanted to be anywhere other than listening to their father speaking about monetary union. But talking to them afterwards, long afterwards, that they do have happy memories of listening to Seamus Heaney that evening. So they found something, not monetary union, but Seamus Heaney brought back happy memories. When I spoke here in 2010, Ireland was in crisis. There were a lot of people in the audience who felt that there was no way out of this. Now we know we're coming out of it, and I think in terms of looking at how we can do our work better, how we can restore trust, how we can make institutions work better, that knowing that there's a future helps. I want to talk about a couple of points. Some of the inherited strengths in our system which we need to build on and not lose. The case for more specialism in the public service, the role of public debate in economic policy, and weaknesses in our regulatory framework, or strengths in our regulatory framework. Now, the failures of the boom year arose from hubris, a failure by the public service to look for or read unpleasant truths, and in some cases too cosy a relationship with interest groups. We know that now. But there are strengths, and I was having dinner 2 years ago with a very senior Troika official and 2 other Irish economists. And we Irish economists spent, it was a mini McGill summer school. We talked about all the things that could be done better, what was wrong about Ireland. And at the end of the dinner, the Troika official said, look, you have one of the best public services he'd come across. Now, I was immediately conscious of the fact that Troika officials don't need good public services, they only need bad ones. So that was not necessarily, but his point was that actually that there are things that work in Ireland, don't throw them out and build on them. A number of the strengths, firstly, there has been a relative absence of corruption in Ireland. Now, it is the evidence of the corruption which we have found which has been so striking and shocking because it is there. But going back to the foundation of the state in 1922, when Sinn Féin, in its different forms, took over, one of the things that there was a big move to clean up corruption at the time. Now, I think zeal weakened over time. But it is something where it is in the planning tribunals, which we had to have to clear out the Augean stables, which shows where corruption does creep in. But we need to keep a system which is pretty uncorrupt, where backhanders, you don't have to pay money to somebody under the table when you go into A&E. You will be either well treated or badly treated no matter what you do. You don't have to pay backhanders to teachers. That is the society. It would be shocking if it were so. We need to keep it that way. But one aspect of that is, how do you prevent corruption? And one way you do it is by rule-based systems, where you have rules and the minister will be treated just like anybody else in A&E. Teachers, I see somebody looking shocked at the idea, but I know ministers who and I have seen a Taoiseach brought in and will be treated in the same way as anybody else. All right, I won't labour that point, as obviously you disagree. But the way we do our business, the way we prevent corruption, is by having rules. And we've seen in the medical card fiasco that there are problems with that rules can be heartless. But giving the minister the discretion to sort the problem out by, I'll give the people who are protesting medical cards, or I will give them access to fast track in the A&E or whatever. That is not the society we want, and how we deal with it is by a set of rules. But designing rules which will never be heartless is impossible. And the pressure and getting the tension right between a rules-based system and one which deals with exceptions, which deals with the problems, is difficult to do. And I think it's a challenge for the system. The second aspect of the public sector, which I think we should not lose, and which is important but has downsides, and that is its independence of politics. I had thought that this came from the British regime in 1922. In fact, the Dublin Castle regime that preceded it was highly political. Senior people were appointed because they knew somebody, because they were not Irish and therefore safe. And the incoming regime in Sinn Féin, the incoming government in 1922, put in place a regime where they wanted to actually, the best got the jobs. They did not want it to be dominated by political appointees. Now, of course, they immediately fell by the wayside to some extent. And De Valera, when he came in 1932, replaced some of those, and there were some political appointments. But the tradition in Ireland, unlike Germany or the United States, where all of the top jobs are replaced every time the administration changes, I think that that is a strength, but it is also a weakness. The strength is that the public service has a view of the public interest, which goes beyond the current administration, that you are there to serve the current administration, but you have a concept that there is a wider public interest, and there are times when you should speak out, where you should do something. And in the recent past, we have seen cases where public servants have failed to regard the public interest, getting too caught up in the interests of the current administration. So I think that that is a strength, but it is also a weakness, because when you fire all the top people and bring in new people, then you can get very rapid change in direction. And there is a danger that you have a situation where public servants say, why change, or the belief that the public servant knows best rather than the minister. So there is a tension there. There is an inbuilt inertia, but there is a protection in the long term that you don't get wild changes, and the changes have got to be considered against the wider interest of the public good. I think one of the problems for the public service has been that they've suffered very substantial pay cuts, longer hours, and doing, in most cases, at the individual level of a good job. But the problem is that when you work for an organisation like, say, the HSE, you may be doing a great job, but the organisation is seen rightly to have failed. And it is pretty demoralising when everybody's saying, oh, the HSE is a disaster, and it has been a disaster. We're trying to turn that around. But for the individuals working in an organisation who are doing a good job, who are being paid substantially less, who are working longer hours, keeping up the morale can be difficult. Now, the two areas I want to talk about in terms of reform where change is needed and to some extent happening is, one, the need for specialist expertise in the public sector. That going back to the foundation of the state or before it, there has been a culture of the generalist, that a good administrator is somebody who can run anything. I left the Department of Finance in 1984 when I was told I had to stop being an economist and become a generalist if I was to be promoted. I preferred being an economist. And I think it has contributed to the recent crisis, where there are people who aren't necessarily specialists in particular areas who are not there to advise. And it's not just about a shortage of economists, it's about accountancy, law, finance and engineering skills. It was interesting that in the 1970s and 80s, why did we have a lousy telephone system? The Department of Postal Telegraphs was ruled by generalists, but there wasn't an engineer allowed in the door. Now, by contrast, in the ESB, which was run by engineers, the lights always stayed on. They did a great job at delivering things, but their cost structure mightn't have been the best. So having a mix of expertise and generalists is important. In the case of the Department of Finance, decisions were made without the benefit of appropriate and adequate economic or financial advice in the run-up to the crisis. But a world run by economists would be a sad place. But a world run without economists is likely to go broke. So it is finding the balance is important. And it's here that there are signs of change, that the new government economic service, where there are young economists now working in a number of government departments, and what's really interesting is they're publishing working papers. They're making available to the wider public for scrutiny their thinking. And their thinking is not government thinking, it's thinking about economic issues, and some of the things that they've published might actually be, if they were considered to be government policy, would be embarrassing. That first of all, they're being encouraged to think, and they're being encouraged to think in a way and open it to the public. And I think that this is quite a change. In fact, one of the papers that really struck me, if instead of publishing it, it had been found by a journalist under Freedom of Information, there would have been headlines in all the papers saying Department of Finance thinks property tax is better than income tax. But because they published it openly, and it was clearly deniable by the government, it was thinking by economists in the Department of Finance. So I think that this is a sign of change. But one of the problems that, all right, they're beginning to bring in economists. They need to look at accountancy professionals, lawyers and so on. But you need a career structure, and there isn't currently an appropriate career structure. Just like I was told, stop being an economist and become a generalist if you want to be promoted. You have to tell people there is a future in being an economist or an engineer in the public service. The importance of debate on economic policy, it's really, if you look back over a long period, how it has changed in Ireland. In the 1950s, the Department of Finance were thoroughly lonely because nobody ever criticised them, or there was very little discussion on what they did, very little oversight. And actually the ESRI was set up by Whittaker to provide a Greek chorus to the department, always saying it could do better. But the importance of the debate today, where the media, in terms of macroeconomic policy, that the people of Ireland know about quantitative easing, they know about burning bondholders. There are a whole range of things we wish we didn't have to know about, but we do know about it. So there is a debate on this, and the media play a huge role in orchestrating, and orchestrating is the wrong word, that means running, but in facilitating this debate. And it makes, I think, for much better decision-making. I was on a committee in Northern Ireland in the early years of the last decade to look at advice on economic policy. And it was really striking. The civil service just wanted us to talk to the civil service. And I said, we need to talk to journalists. And the absence of a civil society debate on economic policy in Northern Ireland compared to what was happening in the Republic was really striking. And the sophistication of the policy-making process. Policy-making isn't about civil servants. It does actually encompass the people of Ireland when it comes to macroeconomics. We're all macroeconomists now, but we mightn't wish to be, some of us. I do, but the rest of you mightn't. The final area I want to talk about is on macroeconomics is very well reported in the newspapers. We discuss it. I heard a horse running called quantitative easing in a race. When it's reached that stage, yes, there is debate. But it's when you come to microeconomic issues, like electricity, gas, competition policy, water, telecommunications, that there's a much thinner debate. The media don't have expertise in this area. The public are much less well informed in this area. The level of debate is much less sophisticated. And the lobby groups, the interests are far stronger. That you have large companies who can make a huge gain if public policy moves in one direction, who can afford to publicise their objectives in a way and say this is the public good. For example, the industry lobby looked for a subsidy for electricity in 2009 and got 400 million at a time when we were cutting social welfare payments. There was 400 million and people said, oh, this is good for industry, it's good for business. The fact that it was bad for the people of Ireland, there wasn't a debate about it. People didn't spot what was going on. And so there is a problem in this area in terms of debate. And it's interesting, in Northern Ireland, in the absence of a political system, they had the General Consumer Council in Northern Ireland provided this role of Greek chorus, where they actually did question public policy in terms of the interests of the consumer in a way that was important. But that was because there wasn't an operating political system. The economics of regulation are, I think, extremely important. And one of the things that Plato had this idea of the philosopher king, never a queen, who would rule the world, and thankfully we discovered democracy is a much better way of doing things. But there are some philosopher kings or philosopher queens whom we appoint, and they're the economic regulators. And when it works well, it can work very well, but as we have seen in the case of the failure of the regulation of the banking system, it can work very badly. But having been on the Northern Ireland Authority for Energy Regulation, I've had some experience, and I'm now on the board of the Central Bank post-crisis, and I've had some experience of this. But There are a number of features of regulation if it's going to work. First of all, the objectives of the regulator should be singular. Give the objective to the regulator. You are to minimise the cost of energy for the people of Ireland, and they can go off and do it. But if you tell the regulator you're to minimise the cost, you're to look after the poor, and you're also to do something about global warming, there's a problem. Because you're then arbitrating between three objectives, and that's the role of politicians. It is not the role of the independent appointed regulator to decide on how much I spend on poverty reduction and how much I spend on making electricity cheaper for industry. That you've got to give a single objective. And in the Honohan report on the failures of the central bank, one of the things he identified was telling the central bank it was to look after the financial system and to promote the financial services sector, that was a really bad mistake and has been taken out. But we've seen even in terms of the ECB a debate in Europe. They're there to look after inflation, but they also have to look after the stability of the financial system. And in Germany, they only see one objective. So it is difficult, having been on the other side in the north, having to arbitrate between minimising the cost for consumers and global warming. Really, that should not be the job of a regulator. So try and simplify things by giving a simple remit to the regulators. Regulators don't want to take unto themselves the role of arbitrating between different policy objectives. The second thing is accountability. You appoint somebody, they're appointed, but they must be democratically accountable. So appearing before the Oireachtas is an important role, and I've appeared before the Northern Ireland Assembly in a similar role. But there was a bit of a problem when most of the time I was there wasn't an assembly, and the half-life of a British minister was about 7 months in the north at the time. So that really you are rather left on your own in terms of accountability. But the relationship then between the regulator and the department is important. In the north, our relationship with the Department of DETI, whatever DETI stands for, I've forgotten now, was good. They understood what their role was, and I think in the south the role between DCENR, the Department of Communications, etc., and CER, Comreg has been, they've understood. But the area where we now have a problem is in water. And I saw it in Northern Ireland first, where the Department of Regional Development and the Minister there, that they set up water in the north with huge costs. And the regulator's hands were tied. And the regulator said, look, the people of Northern Ireland are going to pay a huge amount for water, which they shouldn't be paying. There are far too many people employed. But the department and the minister interfered to say, this is the way it's going to be. Democratic right. But what's the point in a regulator if they can't actually deliver on the mandate of minimising cost? And we have a similar problem now in the Republic, where the Department of the Environment, just like DRD in the north, have done something similar. They've set up Irish Water with huge costs. Don't blame Irish Water. This is the way it has been set up. And then the CER, who's to regulate, what do they do when the cost base has been built in? So that there is an issue here in terms of relations between government departments and understanding of the political system of what its role is and what the regulator's role. If you're going to have a regulator, you need to understand this. And the final thing, just which I want to end on, is there is a danger of regulatory capture, that you can become too close to the regulatees. And we saw that the relationship between the central bank and the financial services regulation part of it and the financial system, it wasn't that they were in each other's pockets, but they were not aloof enough. And the Honohan report goes through this. So the era of light touch regulation is gone. And I see, even last week in the papers, people in the financial services sector complaining about regulation. I think we must remember when regulation failed when it was light touch. It may be too heavy touch, we've got to get it right, but there is an important role for regulators, given their objectives, to pursue them independently of all the interest groups. And knowing that the lobby groups are extremely strong and the oversight through the media, through the people of Ireland, by the people of Ireland through the media, is much less than in the case of macroeconomic policy. It's an area where I think we have to do better in terms of how we debate this with a wider public over the coming years. Thank you.